What's going on, friends? When it comes to the big air-cooled V-twin market today, there's really only two major players left, and that's Harley-Davidson and Indian. So, as you guys all know, I am a Harley guy, but naturally, I'm really curious as to how Indian's Thunderstroke motor actually stacks up against the Milwaukee 8. Maybe there's some things Indian could have done different, and maybe there's some things Harley could have done better. So guys, as you know, Indian came back. Polaris bought Indian, and they came back, much to the dismay of Harley-Davidson. But when they did, they came out with an all-new engine that really kind of took a knock at Harley-Davidson, making it 111 cubic inches. That was kind of a knock at the Screamin Eagle 110. Now, and to be honest with you guys, if it wasn't for Indian, we may not have seen the Milwaukee 8. Harley-Davidson may have just continued on with the twin cam for several more years before they absolutely got squeezed out by emissions. So for me as a Harley guy, and there is another manufacturer out there that directly competes with the motorcycles I like, I want to know some more about their engine, and I want to see how this stacks up against the bike I like with the Milwaukee 8 engine. So guys, let's do a quick rundown comparison of the Thunderstroke and the Milwaukee 8 engine. Let's get down to the brass tacks and take a look at the internal workings of the engine. And then later on, we'll take a look at some horsepower and torque figures and see how these two engines really stack up against each other. But before we get too far into the video today, please don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, and please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. Now, first off, Indian with the Thunderstroke, they use a single pin crank, which is very interesting because obviously very similar to Harley-Davidson. Harley-Davidson has the single pin crank. That's pretty much a given to that sound. But with the Indian, what they use is they use a one-piece crankshaft that actually has plain bearings. Now, we were a little disappointed with the Milwaukee 8 when it came out. Yes, it still had the knife and fork design, but I was personally very hopeful that they would go back to the Timken bearing setup, which didn't happen. So the Milwaukee 8 still rides on roller bearings and uses a three-piece pressed crank. Now, interesting enough, with the Indian, they do have that single piece crank that runs on plain bearings. It does have a 49-degree V angle, but their V angle is offset, which is mainly due to using the plain bearings. Now, Harley-Davidson still running the 45-degree knife and fork, which they have to kind of do that to really keep that signature sound. Now, that can be arguable with the Milwaukee 8 because the Milwaukee 8 really doesn't have that thump like the twin cam had. Now, of course, the Thunderstroke is pushrod driven, parallel push rods, which that's a nice setup. Good parallel push rods, you don't have any harsh angles. Now, Harley-Davidson still does have some angle to their push rods, but it's not nearly as harsh as it was on the Evo, and they'd already solved that problem with the twin cam, so really nothing new there. Now, what's interesting on the Indian motor is that it has three cams in it. The actual intake cam drives the intake valve for both cylinders because, surprisingly, it is a two-valve motor. Now, with that single intake cam, this is actually driven by a chain off the crankshaft. Now, this one single cam also drives the exhaust valves, which they're paired together with a gear drive. Now, I think you guys are already starting to see where the Thunderstroke motor is a bit more complicated than the Milwaukee 8. Now, the Milwaukee 8 keeps it really simple. They went back to the single cam design, which I really love because it harkens back to the old Evo days, but they still use that chain-driven design, which it is much improved from what it was on the 88s and actually throughout all the twin cams. So much more simplicity there with the single cam. You don't have that three cam design that's gear-driven plus a chain off the crankshaft. That could be a pain in the butt to work on later on down the road. Now, engine construction as a whole, Harley-Davidson stuck with basically their tradition, because that is Harley-Davidson. They have the divorced transmission, which I know a lot of guys don't like that, but I love it. But Harley guys love that thing, because if you got a problem with the transmission, swap out the gear set. It's easy to work on. You don't have to disassemble the entire motor to get down to the transmission. Now, with the Indian, they went with a complete unitized construction. Now, in using unitized construction, they actually have a gear-driven primary. Now, the chain-driven primary on the Harley-Davidson, they still use it because of the divorced transmission, which it's really old school, but it works very, very well on these close-firing V-twins, especially the Harley and the way they fire. Now, the other interesting thing about the Thunderstroke motor is that Indian went with a gigantic clutch in this thing. And the reason why they went with a gigantic clutch, which meant they could use fewer clutch plates, which reduced lever effort. Now, on the flip side, Harley-Davidson basically stuck with their standard multi-plate clutch, but they had a hydraulic operation, Brembo hydraulic operation, which that has gone away. On late model M8s, they went back to a cable-operated clutch, and you may or may not have noticed, but you lost the heel-toe shifter. So Harley did make some cutbacks and compromises here on the late M8s. Now, when it comes to compression, the Indian is running 9.5 to 1 compression. This is on the 111. 9.5 to 1 compression, that's decently high for a 2-valve head. Now, it was interesting that Indian chose to go with the 2-valve head, but at the time they developed that engine, they were competing against the twin cam. The twin cam was still a 2-valve head, so I'm just, my personal speculation, that's why Indian stuck with the 2-valve. Now, as you all know, that Harley-Davidson went with smaller valves on the Milwaukee 8, but you have 8 valves, 2 intake, 2 exhaust on both cylinders. And with the Milwaukee 8 being a 4-valve headed motor, you could actually run 10.5 to 1 compression, and that's what Harley did with targeted cooling with either oil or water, depending on if you have the twin-cooled model or not. So, I am a Harley guy, and I may be a little biased, but I think the Indian is an excellent motor. That Thunderstroke is a very, very solid engine. They are very reliable. Although Indian did have some connecting rod issues, they were bending, and especially when they came out with their 116 kit that you could put in it, it came with new connecting rods to actually solve that issue. But that's all been cleared up as far as the Indian goes, and as a lot of you are aware, Harley-Davidson does have the sumping issue with the Milwaukee 8, but they have come out with an updated oil pump. Unfortunately, if your Milwaukee 8 didn't come with that, you're on your own to install that new updated oil pump, and as always on the Milwaukee 8, it's recommended to get a vented transmission cover or a vented dipstick to try to alleviate some of that sumping issue. But when it comes to sound, Indian has a pretty decent sound to it. I mean, I think it was close enough just basically not to get Harley-Davidson stirred up. They put a very close firing order on there, and they do have a good thump to them, but it's still not that signature Harley-Davidson sound, and as you all know, that symmetric manufacturers like Honda, Kawasaki, they came out with single-pin cranks that sounded very close to Harley, and Harley actually tried to sue Honda over it at one point. But all biases aside, the Milwaukee 8 is just a much simpler engine. Does it have its problems? Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of things with the Milwaukee 8, like I would have liked to have seen Harley-Davidson go with that single-pin crank with plain bearings and maybe a gear-driven primary, but that's just not Harley-Davidson. So Harley-Davidson's really got to kind of split the difference and keep everybody happy, come out with an updated motor, but still keep the simplicity and everything that makes it a Harley-Davidson. So how do these two engines compare as far as power goes? Now, the Thunderstroke 111, it's going to put down about 75 horsepower, and it's going to net you roughly about 100 foot-pounds of torque. Now, comparing the 111 to the 107 Milwaukee 8, the Milwaukee 8 107 does have the shorter stroke crank in it, but it does edge out the 111 when it comes to horsepower. The 107 puts down bone stock 80 horsepower and roughly about 95, 98 to 100 foot-pounds of torque, somewhere in there. Now, when it comes to the 114 Milwaukee 8, when we're comparing to the 111, you're going to be getting about 85 horsepower and just over 100 foot-pounds of torque, maybe about 100 to 105. So both are great engines. They're very comparable in their horsepower and torque numbers, although the Milwaukee 8 does edge out the Thunderstroke in the horsepower department. Now, they're pretty close on torque. They're both pretty evenly matched there. So at the end of the day, I may ride Harleys, but I can really appreciate what Indian has done with creating this new motor. Well, Polaris. Polaris owns Indian, but I can really appreciate what they've done with the engine. They actually gave Harley-Davidson some competition, and I'm really happy to see Harley-Davidson step up with the Milwaukee 8 and try to beat that Indian motorcycle. Now, the one thing I will stand firm on is that Indian just does not have the fit and finish that Harley-Davidson has. No other motorcycle manufacturer out there has the fit and finish of a Harley-Davidson. But anyhow, guys, that's all I've got for you this week. Please don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. But anyhow, until next week, guys, please stay safe on the streets, dodge the cars, don't get run over out there, and I will catch you guys back here with a new video next week. Thanks for watching.